Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It is Tuesday, the 26th of April, 2022, 5:30 p.m. London time. And this is Planetary Perspectives on Digital Technologies. It's the second talk as part of CSM Digital Innovation Season 2022. And the theme of this digital innovation season is the intersection between technology and ecology. So in this program, we look at how nature impacts technology and how technology impacts nature. And in the season, there's both a theory part and a practical part to the offerings. So we're offering a series of digital skill workshops for students on everything from machine learning to creative coding, 3D modeling, generative arts, electronics, robotics, eco-web design, and digital tools in our biolab. And there's also a series of talks every Tuesday for the next 5 weeks, and this is the second talk in that series. So today's talk is called Planetary Perspectives on Digital Technologies, and we're here to explore the relationship between technology and nature in a more conceptual level, on a more conceptual level and from a futures perspective. And I think we'll probably also ask a little bit what is technology and nature to some degree. And we're really thinking about the changing, malleable relationships between technology and humans, other species, the planet, and the universe. So I'm Stephanie Sherman, the course leader of MA Narrative Environments in the Spatial Practices program, and I have the great pleasure of chairing this session. And I want to thank the whole team at the Digital Innovation Season for curating such an incredible series at CSM that really pushes the conversations around design, its philosophy and practice. To thank our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and to thank all the students for joining the session and bringing your questions and curiosities to the issues at stake today. So we do have students joining online as well as in person at the LVMH Theater at Central St. Martin's. And we've got people there to help coordinate across platforms and connect the digital and the hybrid realms. So I just want to remind all the students that are with us today before I introduce our esteemed panelists that your questions are really, really important. And we'll hear from the panelists for about an hour total, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And so we're going to ask you all to write down your questions and put them in the chat. And we'll save the questions for the end of both presentations where we can have a conversation, but you don't have to wait to put your questions in the chat. So if something comes up as you're hearing things or thinking about things, just go ahead and pop your question in there and we'll collect them and ask them at the end. We want to remind you that it's good to keep your cameras and microphones off as this session is being recorded. So that's really useful to, there will be some future sessions, a future way to watch this, but we want you to stay so that we can be part of the whole conversation. Now, for our panelists, I'll introduce them both and then turn it over to Dr. Betty Marenko to present first. Dr. Betty Marenko is a transdisciplinary theorist, academic, and educator working across process philosophies, design studies, and critical technologies. She is the founder and director of the Hybrid Futures Lab at Central St. Martin's, a transversal research initiative developing speculative, pragmatic interventions at the intersection of philosophy, design, technology, and future crafting practices. She is the contextual studies leader for product design at Central St. Martin's, having previously held teaching posts at the University of Essex and the University of Urbino, Italy. She's the co-editor of the volumes Deleuze and Design and Designing Smart Objects in Everyday Life, and her writing has been published in New Formations, Design and Culture, Design Studies, and Digital Creativity. And she's the reader in Design and Techno-Digital Futures at UAL. Next up, we'll hear from Reza Negarestani. Reza Negarestani is a philosopher and writer. Since the early 2000s, he has contributed extensively to journals and anthologies and lectured at numerous international universities and institutes. His latest philosophical work, Intelligence and Spirit, published by Urbanomic/MIT Press in 2018, is an inquiry into the meaning of intelligence at the intersection of artificial intelligence, philosophy of mind, theory of computation, and the philosophy of German idealism. His most recent project focuses on world making and the question of what it means to inhabit a world, as what Wittgenstein would have called a life form. And he's currently directing the critical philosophy program at the New Center and is a faculty member at the California Institute of the Arts. So we'll turn it over to Betty. Thank you both so much for being here and joining us today.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. So all the team at the Digital Innovation Season, it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the students in the audience and everyone else. I will promptly share my screen so we can start with my talk. Here we go. Can you see it correctly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, the inspiration for my talk this evening comes from a recent book titled Critique and the Digital, which I have here, edited by Eric Horle and others. And this book asks, how do we do critique in the algorithmic age? And I want to use this question as a starting point to offer some ideas around knowledge making in the era of planetary computation. And then I'm going to try to push it a little bit further to examine how do we do critical practice. And by critical practice, I mean a world building, terraforming, future crafting set of intervention driven by creativity and the criticality, framed as philosophy in action, as a speculative pragmatism with the aims of producing tangible propositions in the world. So let's start with planetary computation. We talk about planetary to refer to issues, processes, and conditions that span the Earth and transcend nation states. And as the editors of this journal, Noima, point out, however, the planet is not the globe. While the globe is a conceptual category framing the Earth in human terms, so a fundamental human-centric understanding of how the acceleration of the flows of people, goods, money, and ideas has created a sort of integrated domain and also the fiction of globalization. The planet, on the other hand, frames the Earth without any specific reference to the human, but goes beyond the human intentional and perhaps also non-intentional work. So it takes into account our cohabitation, coevolution, and codependency with what is not human, whether we're talking about microbes or viruses or the climate or technologies. So this notion of the planetary really helps us framing computation and its impact beyond the human. One of the characteristics of planetary computation may be said to be a shift from mediation to immediation. And this means that information is increasingly sensed, so perceived through the senses, rather than understood. And this process produces a kind of a sense making where signification is no longer located in objects, but seems to emerge from communicating systems and agents operating as a sort of general hum beyond or below human perception. And this mutation is effectively rewiring human cognitive abilities and our capacity to understand, to feel, to perceive, and to make sense. And the consequences of this rewiring and as a process are certainly remarkable. For instance, for Luciano Floridi, professor of philosophy and ethics of information at the University of Oxford, the human understanding of the very fabric of reality is changing. Virtual and real are now enmeshed, with the digital online world spilling over and merging with the analog offline world. He calls this the on-life experience. Information and data, as well as their design, management, and trading, are the new currency. Human understanding of objects and of the nature of reality is shifting, he says, from a mechanistic Newtonian perspective to an informational one. And what really matters in this process is how this new computational sensory environment produces a more than human experience, where there is no longer a need for a perceiving subject, where subject and object are or seems to be unhinged, and where the subject is decentered from its classical location as the agent of reason. One thing is certain, that we humans are now inhabiting hybrid ecosystems where the organic, the artificial, the engineered, the synthetic come together in entanglement of silicon and carbon. And whether we are philosophers, designers, engineers, computer scientists, artists, or practitioners, this is the landscape we have to contend with in our critical practice. Now, for some, this landscape is perceived as an existential threat to humanity. And for others, is the route to superintelligence. I would like to stay clear from both techno-dystopia or techno-euphoria, both highly deterministic narratives, and instead pose the challenge of how do we radically rethink reason in a planetary context of non-human reasoning, which is computational, and how do we reflect on the impact of this new logic of the outside and of the unknown for critical practice. To articulate these new ecologies and epistemological and ontological reorganization they initiate, I think it's useful to look at some of the original ideas behind the notion of planetary computation, so to better grasp also its consequences. In the 1980s, French philosopher and activist Felix Gauttari was one of the first thinkers to actually talk about planetary computation. He envisioned the emergence of new ways of living and being based on the increasing miniaturization and the personalization of apparatuses. And already in 1979, he had written, and I'm quoting, "The computer is effectively on the point of being integrated into a complex of enunciation in which it will become impossible to separate out human intervention and machinic creativity." Effectively, Gauttari here is anticipating the current landscape where the human and the non-humanity of machines cohabit in new ways. He then developed this idea further in his book, The Three Ecologies, where he discussed how the acceleration of the technological and data processing revolutions, as prefigured in the phenomenal growth of a computer-aided subjectivity, would lead to a fundamental repositioning of human beings in relation to both their machinic and natural environments. He also placed a great emphasis on the creative and liberating potential of the new form of subjectivity that would emerge in what he called the post-media era. I think Gauttari furnishes us with important ways of thinking about the new human-machine ecologies that we inhabit in a way that are stay clear from the techno-determinism and also from the very naive notion that machines are just the neutral tools. And instead, what his position highlights is how planetary computation undermines the structural distinction between machine and cognition and forces us to rethink that boundary between what is human, what is non-human. Another way, perhaps, of describing this scenario is as technological unconscious. And indeed, the Gauttari has been described as the first general ecologist and theoretician of a technological unconscious by Eric Horl. This expression, technological unconscious, was originally coined by an Italian artist called Franco Vaccari, whose book Fotografia e Inconscio Tecnologico from 1979 developed some ideas he had already introduced in his work in the 60s. At the Venice Biennale in 1972, he installed a photo booth, inviting the audience to leave a photographic trace of their passage in real time, effectively producing the condition for an incomplete artwork and prefiguring a new connection between users, art production, and technology in a way that in the 90s would be, called perhaps relational art. The technological unconscious, therefore, concerns the autonomous capacities of the machine and its power to produce a memory independent from human awareness. So inserting the power of randomness and contingency by recursively reshaping the world. This increasing autonomy of the machine has key implications that we are beginning to witness now. So let's look a little bit more closely at how machines work, and in particular machine learning. Machine learnings are systems that they're calculative techniques that quantify and compress the world through discrete functions by posing problems as a binary question, yes or no. They are systems of decision-making that select a particular result or output among possible alternatives. And they are also environments designed to learn recursively, so they're not programmed. The central principle of machine learning is the automated discovery of abstraction. What does it mean? It means that on the basis of the data the machine is fed, then it is able to automatically generate the abstractions needed for detection and classification, patterning and ranking. So what the machine is doing is extracting and organizing information from data. Several digital media theorists and commentators argue that deep and machine learning are quasi-autonomous artificial agents, system characterized by two key elements. First of all, that decision-making is now transferred from human to machines. And this process affects millions of people every day, and as classification, patterning, clustering, ranking, determining search engine results, spam filters, social media updates we see, targeted adverts and preferences, insurance and credit scoring, fraud detection, predictive policing, market segmentation, and so on and so forth. So first point, decision-making is transferred from human to machine. Second point, human users, including computer scientists, have little understanding of the mechanism through which the system achieves these outcomes. Now, while computer scientists are really trying to find solution to this so-called interpretability problem, I am more interested in how the designer, the practitioner, the social scientist, the philosopher, the architect conceptualize and make use of the new modes of knowledge making. And for Beatrice Fazzi, in this article called Beyond Human, Deep Learning, Explainability and Representation, algorithmic modeling, what algorithmic modeling performs is not an interpretation of data, but rather a construction of new complex worlds in equally new and complex computational ways. So this is not even an alternative picture of the world, which is emerging from the machines, but a liquid sequence that exists only in algorithmic form. And therefore, a non-human mode of thinking that precedes our human capacity to think it. And for Fazzi, this is non-commensurable to human creativity and reason. And this is a really important notion. The abstractive capacities, the clustering, the classifying, the ranking, the computational machines display are not only specific to them, independent from the human programmer, but they become incommensurable to human cognition. So we have two different decision-making processes without a shared nomenclature that cannot be measured one against the other, one human, one entirely computational. And therefore, Fazzi argues, this is no longer a computer science problem, but becomes an epistemological and ontological one. And therefore, the question here is, how do we build a theory of knowledge and critical practice that are appropriated to these distinct epistemological and ontological domains without flattening them, but also without creating mystification, and that can work for the designer, the computer scientist, the philosopher, the artist, etc., in their critical practice. It is quite tempting to see incommensurability as the signal of an emerging alien rationality. And one of the risks in this narrative is to be seduced And this is what Kate Crawford and Alexander Campolo argue in their paper titled Enchanted Determinism, which they define as a discourse that presents deep learning techniques as magical, outside the scope of present scientific knowledge, and yet also deterministic, in that deep learning system can nonetheless detect patterns that give unprecedented access to people's identities, emotions, and social character. So enchanted determinism emerges from an epistemic gap that creates epistemic blindness. There is the machine, which is able to enact really accurate predictions. And then there is the capacity of the human observer to interpret the principle behind this prediction and beyond machine decision, which is actually quite limited. So the reasoning of the machine seems to defy human understanding, which then pushes us to recur to the tropes of enchantment, magic, and even alchemy, while at the same time, it produces very tangible epistemological and ontological effects in the world, which are highly deterministic. And for Crawford and Campbell, this is a lethal combination. Enchantment shields from accountability. Determinism intensifies processes of control and classification. So this discourse is, which is really pervasive, is very highly seductive and also ambiguous and misleading. From an epistemological point of view, what artificial intelligence does is a process Crawford and Campbell call of irrational rationalization, that flattens complex social contexts and realities into clear signals for the purpose of predictive analytics. Crucially, this process dispenses with causality in favor of correlation. So we have very large data sets which are analyzed to detect patterns in a nonlinear way. So knowledge is produced not through the cause effect we are familiar with, but through correlation. So that even minimal changes to data input, for instance, small changes in pixels, which are meaningless to a human observer, can cascade in huge variation increases, with machines achieving great accuracy, yes, but the wrong kind of accuracy, in ways that become difficult to control and completely biased. For instance, using facial recognition to ascribe sexual preferences or deciding whether someone will commit a crime or not. We have to remember that these computational processes do not reflect the world. They shape it, deepening contested classifications, inequalities, and hierarchies because they have human bias baked in. Conceptualizing this operation in enchanted terms, so magical terms, is highly problematic, clearly, because it positions them outside of critique and accountability by obscuring that what machines do is mathematical optimization at scales that, yes, are beyond human capacity to understand, but nevertheless, it is still a matter of data compression and statistics. And that's why it's important to examine how we think about data. Probably when we think about data, we might see this, but really data is this. And we know that the original meaning of the word data, from the Latin datum, what is given, describe what exists apparently beyond any argument, as something which is out there, objective and factual. The problem is that data in computational sense is not given, but is captured, literally extracted through computation. And yet, in using this word, we retain this original meaning of something given that appears to be objective. This distortion gives rise to data essentialism, the idea that data are the essence of knowledge making rather than some trace we leave behind. It becomes data orthodoxy, the idea that all organisms consist of data flows, the data are the building block of both computers and humans, the computers can be modeled on the brain. And from thinking that everything is data to the idea that data gives us an objective picture of the world, to say that by controlling data we can predict the future, it's all a series of small steps that then take us into dataism, data behaviorism, and data mysticism even, producing knowledge about the future, relying exclusively on data from the past. And what seems to happen here is that a new kind of objectivity, a new regime of truth seems to emerge. As recursive systems seem to respond in real time to real data, the norms according to which they calculate and predict behavior seem to emerge from reality itself. And as Pasquinelli and Euler vividly describe this process in their work, this becomes a statistical hallucination. So when we talk about data, what we really mean is information, data that has been given a binary form. Data doesn't just exist, it has to be generated. And in this sense, it is a human and social artifact, it is a designed artifact. Clearly, this new data-driven immanence is producing a shift in what counts as knowledge and what counts as rationality. Phenomena are no longer understood by searching for causes, but by trying to predict their occurrences, by looking at the past to see whether they will replicate themselves in the future. As causality dissipates in numbers, and objects of knowledge are continuously reassembled in real time by the fine-tuning of machine learning models, which operate recursively, the time dedicated to decision-making, to reflection, to pause, hesitancy, and even ambiguity and contradiction seem to evaporate, eliminated as useless. Lived experience is captured instantly, and there is no mediation. This is what, for philosopher Antoniette Rovroy, is the very core of algorithmic governmentality. A type of anormative and apolitical rationality founded on the automated collection, aggregation, and analysis of big data, so as to model, anticipate, and preemptively affect possible behavior. This is the regime that engineers micro-sensibility at the pre-individual stage. Think at how each notification that you receive shoves your body into an automatic response. Each ping on your smart device is an algorithmically generated, designed artifact that demands an instantaneous reply from us, user, conditioned to invest our attention accordingly. And this behavior is not entirely intentional, is not even conscious, because it takes place at the pre-conscious and precognitive level. For media theorist Mark Hansen, this is the calculative ontology of prediction and the technical enframing of our experience that effectively designs our tendencies for living and being and existing. And this is where the notion of incommensurability we have just seen becomes even more important, because when computational processes occur within a temporal frame that is incommensurable to the perceptual scale of human experience, because we cannot perceive it, and can modulate our affective sphere outside our perception, then we have already entered a pre-personal mode of contact with our technomedia environment. This microcomputational expansion and redistribution of precognitive sensibility happens before we register this mechanism at the conscious level and below the threshold of human sentience. Forthcoming behaviors are predicted not simply before they happen, but before we might even think of making them happen. And this is precisely the target of algorithmic governmentality, the inactual potential dimensions of human existence, its dimension of virtuality, the conditional mode of what people could do, their potency, their agency. By capturing attention and orienting behavior, algorithmic governmentality anticipates what bodies could do, says Rovroy, rather than what people are actually doing. In this sense, it is a capture of the flows of potential. I no longer am the sum of all the potential that makes me into this not fully predictable horizon of events. I become a selected quantification of that potential available for capture. So how do we resist the modulation of our pre-personal, pre-cognitive sensibility? To quote Pasquinelli and Euler, how do we emancipate ourselves from a data-centric view of the world? A place to examine certainly is the language we use. As many continue to argue, there is nothing artificial nor intelligent in artificial intelligence. Even machine learning, it's not a machine that learns, but a machine that can do powerful operations of mathematical minimization and compression. The language tends to reinforce the myth that technology is autonomous. It mystifies and hides the extractivist and exploitative nature of digital labor, while also hiding the geopolitical autonomy of high-tech companies and enterprises. Artificial intelligence, to borrow Crawford's definition, is actually a registry of power. So to conclude, let's circle back to the opening question: how do we do critique in the algorithmic age? How do we fine-tune our critical practice and resist capture? One way is to develop speculative modes of knowledge production that remain radically open-ended, so to grasp planetary computation's neologic of the outside and the unknown. I think we need to build an epistemology of uncertainty, to work productively with uncertainty and the unknown as a material to make knowledge. And this means an epistemology not concerned with how to recognize an existing epistemic object, what is already known, but engaged in looking for the condition of emergence of what might be or what comes to be, which is exactly what algorithmic governmentality insists on capturing. It is in the potential encounter with the becoming of the world that an uncertain knowledge emerges, a space in between the unknowing and the coming to know. This is the space where we can move away from data as empirical evidence parsed into measurable packets, and instead attune ourselves to intensities whose impact and micro-catastrophes are not only unexpected and uncertain, but also unrepresentable. And this is where the unruliness of the unknown, the potential, the virtual, and the potentiation, the shaping of potential under condition of uncertainty, can feed a kind of critical practice fit for the age of planetary computation, able to resist reduction, to escape capture, to counteract parsing, to confuse coding by inserting healthy doses of hesitancy, pause, and even chaos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. That was fantastic. I'm going to turn it over to Reza now so we can hear from him before opening it up to questions. But if you have questions, don't forget that you can pop them in the chat, and don't hesitate. We will take them all collectively at the end. So Reza, I turn it over to you.
Shall I start?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much, Betty, for a magnificent presentation. I'm going to read and then at some point kind of try to wrap it up with the presentation with a little bit of a kind of conjectural ending. So the topic of the presentation, title of the presentation is Escaping the Decrepit World. The pressing questions of ecological crises and climate change are inextricable from the question of what the human is, not human as a species, as a biological species, or a species being, or a metaphysical register that can either be placed low or high on the ladder of beings. The question of what the human is turns out to be the question of a determinate concept of agency on the one hand, and the question of what it means to be what Ludwig Wittgenstein has called a life form, Lebensform. The central claim of this presentation is that the complete disarray of our current state of affairs, that is a collection of our thoughts, practices, values, and policies with regard to the question of ecology, originate not from antiquated views of nature. They stem from theoretically and practically entrenched misconceptions of humanity as a collective edifice, an idea, a historically collective, historically revisionary collective idea, and correspondingly how humanity must orient itself with regard to nature and other life forms. So it stems from this sort of disarray, disorientation. Two exemplars of such misconceptions in today's intellectual atmosphere are climate change denialism and the resurrection of certain tropes of pre-critical philosophy under the banner of post-humanism, critical vitalism, new materialism, etc., where the critique of the human hubris is mistaken for the obsolescence of the human's true responsibilities and collective vocations. The first, i.e. climate change denialism, issues forth from a metaphysical notion of human exceptionality, which is fixed in its relation to nature, to the extent that human survival at all costs goes hand in hand with the concept of humanity as possessing the highest rank in the chain of beings. This concept of humanity is not essentially against nature, rather it takes the human within the highest orders of nature. So if humans die, the planet can die with it as well, right? This is the unexpressed sentiment of a true climate change denialist. However, in virtue that human exceptionality or human exceptionalism is only a metaphysical register in the order of being, the climate change denialist ought not to be necessarily identified as someone who thinks humans are exceptional, right? By kind of like a twisted sort of conclusion. The point is that as long as a high metaphysical rank in the chain of beings has been posited or considered, climate change denialism can adopt any sort of shape. It can come in different guises. It can even shapeshift to an acerbic anti-humanist doctrine, wherein capitalism or the market as a coming ultimate intelligence can squander the planet with no reference to humanity or the exceptionality of the human sapiens whatsoever, right? On the other hand, the second credo, which is that of post-humanism, critical vitalism, or new materialism, radical ontologies, but not all of them are. Post-humanism is not radical ontology, but more like new materialism. This credo strives to remove any reference to human exceptionality in any sense, right? And instead replaces with natural objects, processes, and material networks, which can undermine human exceptionality bottom up. In the case of new materialism, for example, this understanding takes the form of a thoroughgoing deconstruction of the concept of the human by material networks and actants. This is what you might call to be post-human ontology from below, bottom up, of which the human is only one example of this sort of networks and material actants. In the case of post-humanism, all senses of human exceptionality are voided by virtue of the self-assembling or self-evolving material processes which first manufactured the Homo sapiens and now, on their own, bypassing it. It is not that the human is not exceptional any longer. It is retroactively obsolete. By considering the humans as one network of material ontologies among others, the latter doctrines inadvertently overlook what is most significant about the human and how that true significance should be preserved, reclaimed, and reinvented, so as to systematically address the problems of ecology and the climate change in earnest. As I will discuss, the overabundance of radical ontologies, from new materialism to object-oriented ontology, does not replace collective human action to preserve Earth's ecology. They rather generate the false impression that political ecology of things is a radical shift in restoring the lost balance between humans and nature. But as we see, the plethora of deep material ontologies of nature reflect precisely a false conception of humanity that leads further to political and ethical confusion about how we must rethink our attitude with regard to nature and other life forms. More importantly, in flattening the statuses of material actors and rational agents, leveling them, the distinction between material heterogeneities that simply do things and human agents whose actions incorporate not just know-hows, but also know-thats, knowing that something is the case, and know-whats, knowing what is the case or what can be. The political ecology of things falls back on pre-critical metaphysics and a classical humanism that it was set to escape from to begin with. The human is a hybrid and protean idea. It is not merely an evolutionary animal, not merely the agent of theoretical and practical cognitions, not merely a social and political animal. Human is an idea which is historically constructed and judged, subject to collective revision. In line with Hegel, we can never align the distinction between the totality of the human idea, that is the totality of its history, with what we appear to ourselves in a specific historical moment, as being totalized state of affairs with regard to the idea of the human. So the idea is incomplete, the totality is not achieved yet. It's the moment that we delude ourselves that the totality has been achieved, that the problems starts to crop up. To confound the human idea as a process of historical totalization in progress with an achieved or completed totality is to mistake what is the artifact of historical self-consciousness for an essence or a thing, and thus succumb to the pernicious view that human is a metaphysical exception, an apex in the chain of beings. If we arrive at such a confusion, we have written a recipe for disaster for ourselves and others. The historically completed human is a distasteful metaphysical notion, which wreaks havoc in the world, not only because such a notion is perceived as free from the laws of nature and its constraints is illusory, but because it only claims history, a judgeable sequence of conceptions and transformations, in favor of the human as a species being, rather than human as a rational life form, which is historically collective and is under construction. As a species, the exceptionality of the human is a source of the illusions of history and human unaccountability, and therefore a prime contributing factor to destruction of the planet. Yet in a latter sense, i.e. as a judging and judgeable life form, namely the locus of responsibility and accountability, the human is sui generis, is unique in a certain sort of way, in a normative sort of way. It is the exceptionality of the human as a historical concept under revision, a value monger, an agent with the faculty of judgment, a political animal, and a technical builder, all at the same time, that makes the human the index of accountability and the provenance of axiological values and disvalues. The cancellation of this sense of exceptionality, i.e. the human's power of judgments about values and disvalues, particularly projected onto its own actions in the world, inexorably culminates in a view of the world as already imbued with judicial powers, and hence values and disvalues, oughts and ought nots, given to us by gods and other supra beings. But what is this, if not a fully mythic or religious view according to which, or theological view, according to which values and hence responsibilities which are attached to them readily come from nature or God? Insofar as value is only an outcome of judgments, practical and theoretical, by taking away the exceptionality of humans' power of judgment and placing it in the hand of nature or God, such a view inadvertently ends up downplaying the role of humans' culpability in planetary destruction. It kind of whitewashes it. Put differently, this view essentially veils the fact that we are culpable to the extent that values and disvalues originate from our own judgments and not from anything extra-human. This is why the reinstatement of human exceptionality in the latter specific sense is the only way to accentuate the human culpability and bring it to the level of concrete self-consciousness that can be translated to coordinated collective action. Here, the falsity of claims which suggest human exceptionality in all senses should be abolished can be intercepted and neutralized. If the idea of the human is not constrained by history qua sequence of judgments or critical self-consciousness, then it is only a register of being and not thought, of a plethora of material actants with which nature is replete. But then, can such an index of the human as one actant among others, as an agent whose reasons and judgments are now seen as mere know-hows prevalent in nature, can say anything critical or axiological about the ecological crisis, about the accountability, values or disvalues, and the existential risks in which all life is now entangled? The answer is no. For if the deontic and modal planes of the human rationality have already been reduced to the level of an immanental plane of vibrant matters, then how can one say that all lives should be recognized, that we should change our course with regard to the ecological catastrophes which are at hand? Furthermore, deontic and modal thoughts, such as the statements about ought, necessity, possibility, what could have been the case, and how the world could be otherwise, are unique activities which, although have naturally evolved, their functions and contents are not natural, but logical and conceptual and consequential. To reevaluate empirical facts about a bee's dance, dead reckoning of ants, and what goes on in our bodies are themselves derived from the labor of theorization and cognitive practices, which are both conceptual, logical, and technical. They are non-woven, slender fibers of know-hows and know-thats and know-whats so tightly pressed together that we can think of them as a felt. In such a structure, it is impossible to have the empirical without the rational, or separate know-hows from epistemologically know-thats or know-whats, in the fashion that actor network theory and material ontologies diagram the human. Yet even empirical facts about the state of affairs, extracted through unique human conceptual and epistemological activities, do not by themselves tell us how we ought to do and how possibly the world can be different or rebuilt otherwise. They do, however, impose negative and positive constraints, as well as pragmatic ones, on our theoretical and practical reasons and on how we ought to act. In a nutshell, they give us freedom, both negative and positive freedoms, freedom from something and freedom to do something. Human rationality then should be understood not just in terms of its capacity to extract empirical facts about what is the case about the world. More importantly, it should be understood in terms of its multifaceted deontic and modal richness, thinking about the possibilities of this, how this world could have been, or what can it be, or how it could be otherwise, as if we could do something, right? This rational imagination, collective rational imagination, without which, most importantly, it should be understood in terms of its multifaceted deontic and modal richness, without which there would be no collective imagination or action capable of thinking about the possibility of a world without ecological destruction and concretely moving towards that possibility. Modal and defeasible thoughts, such as necessity, contingency, possibility, counterfactuals, counter to the fact, are at the core of any decisive political action, not only with regard to our lives as human, but also with regard to the life in general on this planet. Yet modal elements of human rationality and rational imagination are always rife with risks, where the consequence of choices and actions can go awry in spite of our best intentions, and we end up finding ourselves in a far more ecologically dystopian world if we dare to think what might be possible, or what world we could have. Thinking about a different world is a hazardous business, after all. Accordingly, one might object that anything that has at its basic component a human risk factor should be put aside, to the extent that human rationality has an indelible component of risk, in fact, risk being its very engine. Then the investment in the human rationality should be discontinued. But no, the risk that constitutes the human rationality is what highlights the negative and positive constraints of rationality, its disabling and enabling moments, its learning, historical learning process, and its maturation. Without the concrete consciousness and assessments of this elemental risk component, reason will be caught in an eternal titanic battle between its worst impulses, indifferent idleness, and compulsive destruction. In other words, reason will turn into either a global justification for resignation, a cynical reason, or a suicidal reason that kills everything in the course of cannibalizing itself. Ecological ruins brought upon on this planet are direct consequences of these two pathological forms of reason, the cynical and the suicidal, which are now bolstered by capitalism and neoliberal politics. So then, what should we do? Coming back to the wrap up. Well, as I said, probably one of the first steps would be investment in collective imagination about possible worlds we could have, or we can have, or we might have at some point. Worlds of which we are deprived, and worlds we are cursed to live in. But that's opens philosophy and ecological thought to a notion which, borrowing Nelson Goodman's title, his book title, I would say The Way of World Making, right? not world making in the sense that people are throwing it around in terms of, making world building, like in video games and so on and so forth, but world making in the sense that when we are making a world, we are remaking the world we have. At the same time, we are also unmaking it. So there is an act of resistance to the worst impulses of the current world, and also change of configuration of the ingredients and the order and the accentuations and the priorities of the current world. That is really the business of world making. Essentially, world making then becomes recognizing, namely cognizing anew, the world which we have already cognized. This, of course, requires a notion of architecture in the glorious Greek sense of Plato in Philebus, craftsmanship, all-encompassing craftsmanship, that marshals the cognitive and technical resources of mind, both in theory and practice, right? So I will just say what I mean by this sort of architecture, and then I will actually quit. Then I have one sci-fi example that maybe I can actually bring it up when I'm in conversation with Betty. So so when we are talking about world making, as I said, we are talking about a general notion of place, topos, construction, replacement, making and unmaking as a mode of resistance toward the current world, right? This to me is a kind of a philosophical sort of architecture, practice of architecture in the all-encompassing sense that I meant. Let's not quibble over minor details with regard to definitions at this point. Architecture as a discipline is still much beholden to worldly purposes of Heideggerian realms, places, rooms, living spaces, right? Living spaces and conservative technological artifacts, which should perform a certain range of functions in the context of our given phenomenological registers or given faculties of perception and cognition. Even the most technologically unbound buildings, by that I don't mean, our buildings are not really architecture in my sense. Even the most technologically unbound buildings at this point are restricted to what might be called the urban or city space cognition. Sure, cities are engines and attractors of cognitions, theoretical and practical. They are topoi or places, where fluxes of different kinds of information take place in the most explicit way, and architecture blends in the very forms of these flows. However, cities, despite their constant transformation in their nature and function, also happen to be restricted world paradigms. From a complexity theory perspective, there are edifices built on vastly entrenched structural hierarchies, cultural traditions, cognitive perceptual perspectives, the concepts of humanity, technology, intelligence, habituated noetic and phenomenological registers. In this sense, the restriction of architecture to the urban space or a given place, whatever it might be, including the planet itself, is simply to limit the prospects of building or world making to the established order of things. So architecture, in the sense of world making, should escape the established order of things, or at least resist, critically resist it. In this sense, architecture, qua world making, should re-engage philosophically with the world beyond the given order of things, and critically should be considered as an architecture that overcomes the status quo of a world already given. We must take the duality, not a metaphysical dualism, but a logical duality of architecture and philosophy seriously, that they come hand in hand like weird sisters in Shakespeare. We must at last free architecture and world making from its crypto-Heideggerian cage of living spaces for humans and humans only. But what does this endeavor entail? In what follows, I will attempt to briefly formulate what actually world making is. Well, world making, as I mentioned very briefly, it requires a non-exhaustive list of processes by which, when we are making, we are also unmaking things, right? So there making and unmaking are entangled. Resistance and revolution are also entangled. So that might entail processes or procedures of composition and decomposition of the current, world gradients, world ingredients. It can be about accentuating some of the least accentuated elements of the current world. It can involve ordering, rearranging the elements of the world. It can sometimes also involve deletion of some of the elements of this world and supplementing with new ones. It can also register as a kind of deformation, right? And for each of these, there are examples in science history, in arts, in production of work of art, in our engagements with nature and reality. Concrete example that such procedures can lead to creation of a world, but a world in the sense that when we are talking about a world is always a collective thing. It's worlds. It's just a matter of frame of reference that we sometimes call a world singularly, or call a collection of some worlds a world. It's a matter of frame of reference, right? So there is this kind of double meaning. So ultimately, world making in that sense can be said the way of intelligence, because by way of world making, we expand the territory of that which is intelligible. Divested from the intelligible, intelligence means nothing. It is only in correlation with that which is intelligible that intelligence makes sense. And intelligence ultimately, in a kind of late Platonic sort of way in Philebus, is considered to be the craftsman of the intelligible, expanding the realm of intelligibility not only for itself, but also for the world in which it is merely a part. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you so much, Reza. Super wonderful to have your thoughts on this. And again, students that are out there, students that are in the theater, please post your questions. Anything you want to ask for clarification on anything, a big picture question you have, etc. I'm going to start just by framing an issue that I think comes up in relation to both of your talks that maybe we can kick off the conversation with, which is, I think both of you are quite interested in this question of constructedness, that the planetary condition that we have is a condition of not, as Betty mentioned, the globe and its networks of human flows and systems, but also of biological and ecological systems that are evolving. And both of you spoke to this constructedness being both material and tangible, through both the kind of virtual realities of clouds, or through the kind of data centers and servers and kind of more empirical, observable, tangible materials, whether that's labor or objects, let's say, and the realities of these, the cognitive, the perceptual, the ways that these things are perceived, whether they're by human societies or kind of machine perceptions or patterns. So my question is, in terms of practice and design, which is where both of you sort of ended. Betty ended thinking about what is a critical practice. In what ways do we kind of open ourselves up to machine thinking? How do we work with machine cognition in a different kind of way? And for you, Reza, this question around worlding, remaking, recognizing this. I think the question of the empirical is still strong for me. In what ways do we want to, through these processes that we're doing that are clearly, I think both of you are calling for a speculative process in some ways, but how should we think about and account for the empirical, what we might observe through various mechanisms, whether that's in Betty's case, when you spoke about inputs of data that may or may not be part of the input process. How much do we want to add levels of observation to those kinds of scientific regimes, let's say, versus how much do we want to deconstruct them? And Reza, in your case, how much do you think the existing empirical world, whether it, through the frames of reality that we have, is a viable starting point for the reconstruction and recognition as you see the design practice that we should be undergoing?
I think Betty, should start.
That was a gesture that, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Reza, first of all, for such an amazing talk. And I'm going to try to pick up on what you were discussing and what you, Stephanie, posed as a general question. Because the question of how do we deal with these situations in relation to critical practice, which is the pragmatism or the empirical aspect, they're really close to my interest, not only because of my profession as an educator of design students, but also because I profoundly believe that philosophy in itself has to be philosophy in action, has to be speculative pragmatism. So it needs to not just to inform action as in the sense of application of theory, but has to be interconnected to practice in the same way in which the two sides of Moebius strips are feeding one into the other. So there is no effective separation, but there is a kind of virtuous circle, so that speculation feeds practice and practice in turn feeds speculation. As I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, for me, there are two ways that we can enact in order to proceed in this way. First of all is to acknowledge and recognize our positions in terms of what we are saying, the words that we are using, the images that populate our mind, the way in which our imagination is already being colonized, and how we decolonize also our imagination so that other kind of words of futures, potential, can have space to enter and then to be enacted. And I really like what you, Reza, talked about in relation to world building, that it's always about a making, which is an unmaking and a remaking. And that's where the notion of resistance and pushing back becomes really important. And I would like to believe that critical practice, whether a designer, an artist, or a social practitioners or an activist, can really embed that idea and tangible intervention of pushing back and resisting.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's my bit for now.
Oh, thank you so much. Magnificent. I mean, I absolutely loved the talk. I mean, there were so many gems in there, like data essentialism, data mysticism, data religiosity. Stephanie, look, I mean, empiricism and rationalism should be understood as, a happy couple. Because if their relation is not happy, it would be, as I said, it leads to the worst hubris of rationality and the most naive forms of empiricism, which we actually see it today in big data, right? I mean, it is not clear what's, of course, there are really great papers written in the defense of big data, but still there are quite, some blind spots in this whole what you might call to be new empiricism of big data. First of all, does intelligence merely work with given data, with givens? Well, that is hard to actually parse it philosophically. I mean, Wilfred Sellars, who was against this sort of naive empiricism, would say that no, absolutely not. Well, I mean, we are just stretching a little bit. I mean, big data has, what is that, triple Vs or 4 Vs, 5 Vs. You know, it's about variability of type or type of information, velocity of transition of data, storage, veracity, value, and so on and so forth. But I mean, so I feel that yes, big data, this sort of, and big data is now becoming a mode of governance, planetary governance. It is actually not only it has philosophical blind spots, sort of technological unconscious, as Betty was talking about, unconscious in the pure Freudian sense, actually, because the unconscious, what I want to say is Freud was famous and asked his students this example of the unconscious. So he said that there is one room on one side, a chamber, completely dark. There is nothing in it. You can't even go there, right? And then there is another chamber, which is kind of has a mild amount of lighting, and there is a figure standing in the corner. And there is actually a gatekeeper between these two chambers. And he asked his students, what do you think the unconscious is in this example? So everyone said that, well, you know, dark chamber. No, he said that, no, the unconscious is that gatekeeper. Unconscious is that which prevents you to have a transparent consciousness. So the technological unconscious, in sense of big data, is actually what prevents us to have this sort of consciousness about as what is going on in mode of planetary governance and stuff. And this is why that there is a serious ethical culpability issue, because it gives rise to what can be called socioeconomic black boxes. So this is the sort of new empiricism that I think that we should resist against, right? But the other sort of empiricism, yes, I think that it's about the maturation of human rationality, that every time that human reason claims something, it needs to be tested, right? But this procedure of testing the veracity of rational claims is itself not either purely rational or purely empirical. it is made within the ambit of scientific theorization, where we have scientific observations, we have a theory that combines these observations. We can produce certain sort of facts, and these facts are within the super collider of the scientific theory until the scientific theory reaches a point of crisis, where basically it has to either shed its theoretical edifice or be capable of arriving new facts about reality, right? So yes, no, I mean, world making by in that sense, I completely mean it in the combination, healthy marriage between empiricism and rationalism, because otherwise it would be a naive empiricism, which now we are getting a version of it, namely big data, or it would be, suicidal, cynical reason, where the worst of the human hubris are being unloaded into it.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I think it's really helpful as we think about what we should be designing. And I wonder for both of you to think a little bit about how that question maps onto ideas about machine intelligence. As Betty recognized or argues that it's something that's not programmed, that it's not organized step by step, but rather it's a series of recursive processes that are kind of shaping new forms of pattern detection that can be unintelligible to us. And so how should we think about those aspects of unintelligibility as they shape our responsibility, as you both spoke to?
Well, the way I see this is not to make the mistake of either mystify or deify that unknowability that emerges from a new machinic reasoning and logic, which, as I have explained, are simply incommensurable to our capacity to comprehend and to our velocity and scale. But that doesn't mean that going for the enchanting or enchantment route, as seductive as it may be, and as a classical trope of looking at technology with, it's a viable route. We should be very careful, because that narrative is incredibly insidious. Even esteemed computer scientists often end up in the pitfall of we don't know what's happening, is almost magic. No, it's not magic. Okay. Magic is a word we use for something that hasn't been realized yet. Magic is a craft. And I want to spend a couple of minutes to dissect a little bit the word craft, because as emerged both in terms of word building and crafting, and when you were talking, Rez, about architecture as this mode of creation and crafting realities, but crafting has also another meaning, which is about being cunning and being really shrewd like a fox, and being, the Greek had this
Metis.
called metis, exactly.
Yes.
And that kind of knowledge, which is really about cunningness, and also knowing where to insert certain practice and procedure in ways that are undetectable, perhaps. The last thing I want to say here is that precisely because we don't know exactly how those machines produce their knowledge, because of the black box, because the incommensurability, we need to make friend with the unknown. And make friend with the unknown in a sense of taking uncertainty as the core of a knowledge-making process, not about risk management or about anxiety-inducing practices, but as a material, as a tangible material to work with. And there are ways of doing so. There are ways, historically, there are practices of divination that use the opportunity to create knowledge through an encounter with the unknown. There are ways of making conjecture in history, for instance. There are ways of thinking in terms of negative knowledge, the knowledge of what we know that we don't know, and so on and so forth. So there are ways, and I really like to see those ways translated into actionable interventions.
Absolutely, Betty. Yes, I mean, I know that you used speculative pragmatism, so I suspect that the pragmatist part of it is from Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, probably, and there is an indication of abductive reasoning, right? Abductive reasoning rather than deductive or inductive reasoning or inductive discovery. Abductive reasoning is actually making friends with the unknown.
Absolutely.
But, yes, and in that sense, abductive reasoning creates a mode of knowledge formation where knowledge is introduced as preservation and mitigation of ignorance at the same time, rather than about merely accumulating facts in the kind of traditional sense. No, it's about preservation and mitigation of ignorance. And that requires a different sort of route to what we don't know.
There is also the notion of learned ignorance. That I think it's really appropriate to what you're saying, which is about understanding the limit of knowledge and working on those limits.
Absolutely.
So it's not about building knowledge or trying to know, but using what we know in order to nourish a practice.
Absolutely.
And imagination becomes so important because in abductive reasoning, it's all about using imagination as a component of thinking. And that goes back to how do we cultivate imagination.
Absolutely. There's counterfactuals, as if thought experiments, yes.
Yeah, which are very much used by designers.
So as thieves and conning people, right?
But designers are plotters.
Yes.
And con artists sometimes.
Yes, yes. The long con of Benedict Singleton's long con, yes.
Perfect. Okay, let me come in with a question we have from Vincenzo Otino. Is a lack of capacity of a rational reading of the new abstract models produced by AI a symptom of necessity to a preemptive design of these tools? Can we design the rational without subject-object?
That's a good question. Okay, let me just reread it there. Is the lack of capacity for rational reading of the new abstract models produced by AI a symptom of necessity to a preemptive design of these tools? So, Vincenzo, what are you saying here is that could we redesign those tools so those mechanisms are sort of interfered with upstream? And that is certainly a problem of the industry itself. And now those biases are baked in at the very source by a very homogeneous workforce, for instance, by lack of accountability, or by a sort of only whitewashing in relation to accountability. I think there are ways in which different models could be designed in. Personally, I would like to see a philosopher in residence in every computer lab.
So just to follow up before you chime in, Reza, our question continues as especially, so can we design the rational without subject object? And especially if we have in mind the incredible asymmetry, even big data experience in the actual contingency of that experience. These machines are tautological or autopoetic, right? This is kind of where the human intervenes, let's say, in that design of that rationality.
I mean, first, I want to actually make a very pessimistic claim here, that I would say that, yes, absolutely, we need to, I mean, the whole design philosophy theme should be more into creating design in these areas. But I would say that it is not as if these things, these sort of technological innovations, which are going to be constitutive of the mode of governance, planetary governance, for years to come, can be collectivized under new capitalist, late capitalist paradigm. Precisely because when we are talking about big data, we are talking about speed of data transfer. We are talking about massive amount of storage. We are talking about processing capabilities, right? And unfortunately, all such, auxiliary technologies are within the dominion of large, highly large corporates, either governmental or private. And precisely because of that, collectivization would be extremely far-fetched idea at this point in these areas. This is something that Nick Sranicek, the author of Inventing Future, asked me a while back that, Reza, do you think that AGI is possible under capitalism, artificial general intelligence, human level AI? Now I actually think that it's impossible under capitalism, because it's not going to happen. Anything that is going to happen, it would be fundamentally, as Betty was talking about, would basically involve a lot of gerrymandering, whitewashing, entrenchment of biases, generative entrenchment, because you see, when these sorts of massive volumes of data comes and you are going to process data points, so any sort of learning algorithm, if it has a minor bias, it starts to reinforce the bias on a higher volume of processing and pattern recognition. And let's not talk about the ideological and theoretical orthodoxies or dogmas also go into the methods of inductive exploration of patterns, in big data. But on the more optimistic side, now that I put that out of the window, I would say that something like that would be more like the autopoietic paradigm. And it was done in a more kind of open source environment. As with regard to the subject-object, when we are talking about subject-object, it's quite vague what we mean by subject and object. I mean, there are different levels of subjectivity. There are different levels of objectivity. But yes, at a very basic epistemological level, the gap is required, you see, because if you say that, well, it is not required even at the most minimal sense between subject and object, there's no gap here. I mean, a kind of distinction. We don't fuse them together. We'd rather integrate them. If you say that it doesn't, even that minimal sort of level is not required, then you are already in the realm of the given, meaning that the world already, like a telltale heart, gives its mysteries and its structures to you. It becomes available to you. But that, of course, we know that nature is not given to us. Reality is not given to us. It is a matter of discovery and construction, re-engineering the minimal correlation between the subject and object, such that the intelligibility of the objective world expands and is brought to bear upon the agentic intelligence of the subject of theoretical and practical reasoning, as a part of the maturation of the subject. We are not talking about free-floating subject here.
Okay, thanks for that, Reza and Betty. We are at the end of our session. I have one more question for Betty that's a more practical one. Which is, Betty, we have a student asking something that students at CSM can get involved in, and could you tell us just a little bit more about it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Of course, the students can get involved. Just launched is a research initiative crossing design, philosophy, analysis of technology. So we are running some initiatives. If anyone is interested, please drop me an email, because we're actually running a workshop in a couple of weeks to test some a new deck of cards called Philosophical Pills, and we might want some volunteers to play with the cards and the new deck. So just drop me an email and I will send you some invitation. Thank you for the interest.
Excellent. Okay, well, I wish we could be here talking for hours about all of these wonderful things that we've just really scratched the surface of opening up today. I want to thank Betty and Reza so much for your contributions and conversation, and remind everyone that as part of Digital Innovation Season, we'll have the next talk is next Tuesday. The talk is from 12:30 to 2 p.m. because our speaker is based in Tokyo. And that talk is called Interstellar Communications, Collective Intelligence, and Biocommunication. And on that panel is a professor of biotechnology who works on microbial communications and an artist working with fungi electrical signals. So it should be almost as fascinating as
What about SETI
sessions.
expert?
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for a great session. And we'll see you next time.
I'm much honored. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really good.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Betty. Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye.